The Bob Murphy Show, episode 415.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today my guest is Alex Nowrasteh, who is the Cato Institute's Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies. I'm just reading a little bit from his official bio here. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, and most other major publications in the U.S. His peer-reviewed academic publications have appeared in the World Bank Economic Review, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Public Choice, and a few others. He's the co-author with Benjamin Powell of Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions, which is from Cambridge University Press in 2020. Alex and I are speaking about immigration, so the context here, folks, is Alex was the one who recently debated Dave Smith at the SoHo Forum on whether libertarians should favor restrictions on immigration into the U.S., particularly in the modern or, in the current political context. Alex was saying there should be very few immigration limitations except for the disease and criminal activity. And Dave was saying, no, it's okay for libertarians to support more systematic limitations on who is allowed to immigrate into the country. Okay. So I gave a response to that on the Mises Institute's Human Action podcast. Alex responded to my episode with some pushback. And then he said, hey, if Bob wants to have me on a podcast, I'm happy to do it. So that's why he's here. Last thing I'll say, once we get going, folks, it's going to be pretty self-explanatory. I'm just letting you know the background here. As is my policy with these sorts of things, I'm not here to debate Alex. That, for one thing, that's just not my personality in terms of if I'm having a conversation with someone and I just want to learn from them. And the point here is I want you to really know what Alex's views are on things. And so that's where I'm going to push him, or to make sure if he makes a claim that, hey, we understand exactly what's backing that up. But also, just in case people are curious, like, Bob, how come you're always, so such a pushover with your guy? I want people who I disagree with to feel comfortable coming on the show. And so that's partly why I think it's good in the long run if I don't try to really blow somebody up, even if I disagree with them. So I think it should go without saying, I don't necessarily agree with what Alex is going to say in this conversation, but we were very civil. And again, the point for me having him on was not to debate him, but just to make sure he got his perspective across so that you, the good folks at home, perhaps in conjunction with my Human Action episode where I largely spelled out what Dave Smith's position was in the SoHo debate, listening to all that stuff, you can form your own conclusion and be very informed for it. Okay, without further ado, here is my discussion with Alex Nowrasteh. Well, Alex, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Hey, Bob. Thanks a bunch for having me.
Glad to have you. And I had thought we were going to be in the corner having our, sort of nerdy economist discussion and then current events. No, what we're doing is both nerdy and topical. So I guess that's a plus.
We don't get to do that all the time as economists, do we?
No. So, folks, Alex and I talked before hitting the go button here. I think the way to structure this, just so you can pace yourselves mentally, there's a lot of dispute and current events going on here. So I think we'll upfront talk about the empirical claims regarding immigration that Alex said at the SoHo Forum debate. I perhaps unwisely challenged him, citing his own research. Not surprisingly, he said, no, my research backs up what I said. And so I'm going to have Alex clarify that. Then the meat of this discussion will be the public property angle on immigration policy from a libertarian perspective that Hans Hoppe and now more recently Dave Smith have been popularizing. And then at the end, of course, we'll talk about the situation in LA at the moment. So with that, Alex, do you want to take it away and just explain, maybe what you said and then why my critique was wrong-headed?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again, though, for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. I think I made 3 broad empirical points that you took some issue with. The first one was about immigrant welfare use compared to that of native-born Americans. And so I cited some research that I did with a co-author looking at the year 2022, because that was the year with the most recent data available. And we broke it out, welfare use. We took a look at a bunch of different programs: Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, SSI, TANF, WIC. And, altogether, this is the vast majority of welfare spending in the United States. And then we broke out per capita consumption of these programs by individuals in 4 ways. So one is native-born Americans, and then all immigrants. And then we further subdivided the all immigrants into the categories of naturalized immigrants. Those are those who have become citizens. And then non-citizens. And non-citizens includes people on a green card, illegal immigrants, people on different work visas, et cetera. So what I said in the debate was immigrants use less welfare than native-born Americans. And so that's true in there. But you also pointed out that naturalized immigrants who are citizens do use more than native-born Americans on a per capita basis. That's true. They tend to be older than native-born Americans, and so they definitely have some higher consumption of Social Security benefits and Medicare, which are,
the naturalized immigrants tend to be older.
Yeah, they tend to be a little older, so they tend to consume more of those benefits because, when you think about the welfare state, there's really like too broad, or not the welfare state, but in terms of like fiscal consumption in the U.S., they're really like temporal benefits where you get a lot if you're young, if you want it, public school, but also a bunch of welfare. Not so much when you're working age. Some you can, but not so much. And then when you're elderly, that's really like where the welfare state is. So if you're elderly, you're just going to more likely to, and that's what we see with naturalized immigrants. But then non-citizens consume the least of all these groups. And non-citizens includes like illegal immigrants, green card holders, et cetera. So you took some issue with that. And I think if I had another 5 minutes to explain it during the SoHo debate, it would have alleviated your concerns with that. But overall, the native versus all immigrant distinction, I think, is accurate and in there.
Okay. And I think that was the one, right, where in my Human Action episode, I don't remember the exact wording, but I may have made it sound as if you were like sort of burying that element, that the fact that the naturalized immigrants were the highest of all groups, and Alex just talked about immigrant, and you, because I remember like in your written response you said something like, no, that's right there in my abstract or something. Yeah. And what happened is that when I was making notes to myself, I just copied and pasted like the beginning part. So anyway, if it did come off like I was accusing you of skullduggery, I wasn't looking at your full abstract when I said that. So that's my limited defense.
No worries. I understand this. The thing is, like, I've done a ton of these empirical studies, right? I have like 60 academic papers about this stuff. Well, not 60, but I have like a dozen academic papers about this stuff and a bunch of others.
That was a pretty big downward revision you just did there.
No, I'm trying to be accurate. I think I have like 60 total papers and a dozen academic and then about, 40 some.
I mean, I'd be like, I can bench like 300 or like 185, but still.
Maybe, 300 on Mars, right? So some of the stuff is pretty thorny and you can get in the weeds, and man, you can like really dig into these details and do it. So no offense taken.
Okay. So can I just to push on that though? So I understand that, like at one level, like if one is trying to say, look at it, this popular notion that, the immigrants are stealing all the benefits from the government. No, because look at all immigrants, it's lower on a per capita basis. And then if you look at the naturalized immigrants, yes, it is higher on a per capita, but once you adjust for age, that's part of it. Do you know, and it's fine if you don't, I'm just curious, is it like, if it were age adjusted, is it really straight down the middle, or do the naturalized still consume more even if you adjust for the age? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah. So if you take a look at, let's say like the 25 to 64 age range, for instance, and we did this in some previous reports, but nobody paid attention, so we didn't replicate it again. But what we basically found is that naturalized use less than native-born Americans, but it's closer.
Okay.
So it's closer. Yeah. And the reason why that is in the American welfare state, to have access to most of these programs, you have to be lawfully present for at least 5 years on a green card. There's some exceptions. So as a result, like if you're legal, you're just going to have more access lawfully to these programs. So that's
when I was going back and forth in my head about, like, when I read your response to my episode first, and I was doing the jousting in my head, that is partly what I thought, that on the one hand, one could say, like, for the restrictionist perspective, like, okay, Alex, fine, even if we stipulate all that, but if for whatever reason the immigrants coming here are older or something, but then if you could say, well, no, the very fact that they're naturalized means they had to have been here, and so that by itself, it's not a random sampling of immigrants, that it means immigrants who have been here long enough to become citizens. Duh, they're going to be older, other things equal, just because of that. Yeah,
just because of that, and just because the legal system does select for people who are a touch older. Just because, a lot of times there's wait times, years and years wait times. So just on that level. And then a lot of people who are naturalized, they come maybe when they're young as students. They get an H-1B visa. They stay on that for 10 years. Then they get a green card. They're on that for 5 years. And then by the time they naturalize, they're like 55. So you're just going to have these types. That's just the way that the law sort of biases it.
Okay. Let me ask just one more just on that narrow point. I think I said a version of this myself, and I saw others in response to, either your pushback or the comments or whatever of my original episode when it dropped, along the lines of, okay, sure, Alex. So yeah, maybe right now the way the system is empirically, particularly illegals maybe don't consume a lot, but isn't that because they kind of got to keep their head down or whatever? And so if we open the floodgates and have open borders, wouldn't, more of the immigrants be of the naturalized version that your own data show, consume more per capita? Something like, do you understand the question? Yeah.
So I think, and the age, right? I mean, the age thing is what really determines a lot of this. So yes, if a lot more people come in, and there's a lot more immigrants, you will have more people who eventually, right, and the welfare system doesn't change. You will have more people eventually who are older, who will be consuming more welfare. But you'll have, I think, the biggest increase in the number of non-citizens. So what we saw when the U.S. had free immigration, like in the 19th and early 20th century, was enormous numbers of people who returned, right, to their home countries. So they would be here for 5-10 years. They'd work, they go back home. Even in the late 19th century, you had about half of English immigrants even return to the UK. You had about 80% of Mexicans return up until the 1980s, according to research by Doug Massey at Princeton. So there's a lot of other things that could change in that scenario, right? Because when we usually think about immigration, we think, hey, people come over, they stay forever because America's so awesome. Nobody would ever want to go back to wherever they're from. And, in my case, in our ancestors' case, that was true. In yours, it was true. But there's a lot of people out of sample who did not do that. And in many cases, the majority of immigrants from certain countries did not stay in the United States at different periods of time. So if you remember when Trump talked about, is this a family-friendly podcast, or can I use a swear word in quotes?
Go ahead. So we might bleep it.
Okay, when Trump talked about the, quote, whole countries, unquote, right? And he said, why can't immigrants come from a place like Norway, right? And we think of Norway as a very wealthy country now. But when you take a look at research by Leah Bustan at Princeton and Ran Abramitsky at Stanford, they did some research about this. The immigrants from Norway who came here were negatively selected. They were basically the losers from Norwegian society. They didn't have any land. They lost their land. They're more likely to flee creditors, etc. So and it was a poor country, right? So they came here, and a good number actually returned. And the ones who stayed were the better ones, frankly. And the ones who were kind of like the losers from that, at that time, SHIT whole country went back. So it's kind of difficult to predict exactly what will happen if the U.S. had a like radically more open immigration system, which I thought was the best point that you made. Or not, maybe not the best point, but one of the best points that you made in your podcast when you were talking about the debate was, hey, these are great points, Alex. You know, empirically, they could totally be true. However, the world could radically change in a lot of ways with free immigration. So are we sure that these relationships would hold?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And then I guess also in fairness to what you're saying, I remember, I can't remember who made the point. I think it might've been like, I saw a seminar or something when I was at Texas Tech. You know, I know you've worked with Ben Powell and so forth on this stuff. I forget who was making the point. It might have even been Ben for all I know, giving a presentation, but anyway, the point being that there's some counterintuitive things going on here. You just triggered this memory, Alex, when you said how people might come here to work in their prime working years and then go back home, like to retire. And I remember that there was some, empirical study about when they cracked down on the border that thinking like, oh, these migrant workers in California, we want to keep them out. But it did the other way around, that when they tightened the border, it just meant the migrants just stayed all year round because they needed to come over to work, because they were sending money back to their family. But then normally when the harvest was over, they would go back to Mexico to be with their kids or something. And then once it got riskier to cross the border, they just decided, okay, I guess we're just staying in the U.S. all year round now, which was, the opposite of what the intended result was.
Yeah. Doug Massey did a lot of that work. He was at Princeton. He recently retired. But yeah, I like to say, if the workers can't go back and forth, their families are also going to come north, because what that crackdown did was it raised the price of a smuggler from something like a couple $100 to like over $1,000 in the 1980s. And that was a huge, and you weren't guaranteed to get in. So all of a sudden, you're right. They made that rational calculation, and lo and behold, the unintended consequences of immigration enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And so on this point too, I mean, I would urge like fans of Dave Smith, from that perspective, just to consider, like by analogy with the drug prohibition stuff, the typical libertarian is not out there saying like, oh yeah, being addicted to heroin's awesome. They're just saying, it's not obvious that even if you're trying to minimize something, that the government cracking down on it is the best thing. And so even likewise here, that plenty of libertarians, particularly those, coming from the left, like immigration, in general and so forth. But my point is, even if your thought, yeah, I would want to live in a world where we reduce that, it's not clear that giving the feds or whoever more power is the way to achieve that, or that even if you could crack down on that one narrow dimension, that there wouldn't be other things that you yourself might find worse.
Yeah, and I think that is a powerful point that should resonate a lot with libertarians, is that whoever enforces these state rules are going to be statists, and they're going to do statey things, and the consequences are going to be, sometimes the consequences are not as bad as libertarians predict, just to be perfectly honest, right? Like, as an empirical matter. But oftentimes they're significantly worse than what the statists predict they will be. And the costs are gargantuan and ex ante unpredictable, because the world is a complicated place. So I think that works with immigration just as well as it works with drugs and any other sphere of human activity and behavior. I think the rise of wokeness, for instance, is a great example of this. Maybe that's a different topic, but that I think was unintentionally caused by a lot of government policies. And we're just dealing with that in ways that nobody would have predicted from the 1960s.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Okay, so on the empirical stuff, for sure, what I would like you to review too is the one about the fiscal burden. And I guess I was referring to a National Academy of the Sciences article in your table too. Can you, again, I know it's a hard ask, because if someone hasn't read your paper, how are they supposed to navigate as they're driving to work, listen to us talk here? But is there a way you can kind of distill the essence of, what I was pointing out, and then why, what your response was?
So you pointed out this massive study we did called the Fiscal Impact of Immigration in the United States. And we built and adapted this massive generational accounting model put together by the National Academy of Sciences, which is just an effort to try to understand how different groups of people, the taxes they pay and the benefits they consume, and try to get a fiscal estimate. And so we adapted a model put out by the National Academy of Sciences, and we updated it in the first part of our paper, which was what you looked at. We basically just updated their model for a more recent year to get analysis. And then we said, we just wanted to show this, to show how comparable this is over time to the National Academy's research. And then we had a Cato model that we did where we made some changes, some methodological changes, basically the ways that some of these things are counted in this paper. I don't know if you want me to go into any of those, but we thought they'd made some mistakes.
Well, can I just say some things? Then you first tell me just if what I said is true, and then we can get into. Okay, so big picture again at the SoHo debate, you said in general, immigrants pay more in taxes than they, are a fiscal burden on the government. So they're net contributors, in other words, and so then I said, well, geez, I'm looking at Alex's paper on here and look at table 2, and it's showing, they had 3 sample years, and they had first generation, second generation, third generation immigrants. And the federal level, it was ambiguous. Like it could be one or the other, but when you did federal, state, and local all lumped together in all 9 permutations of that from Alex's own table 2 with co-authors, it showed that the ratio of how much they pay in taxes divided by how much they get in benefits is less than 1 in all cases, meaning they get more in benefits than they pay in taxes. So what the heck is Alex talking about here?
Yeah, so the exact quote that I had from the debate is, quote, empirical economic research shows that immigrants pay more in taxes than they consume in benefits, or at worst, break even. So, so that one that we're talking about there, so that's an accurate summary of the National Academy's research.
What I just said is a summary.
Yeah, that's an accurate summary of the National Academy's research on one, and I'm getting out the table 2 just to make sure that I am recounting exactly accurate, because there's about a large number of tables in here. And that's under a specific scenario. So they had 8 different economic scenarios that they did where they took a look at this with different ways to allocate public goods.
So can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
So clearly what's going to happen is what I've focused on was, yes, it was in your paper. I didn't misread the table, but you're saying that wasn't what if somebody asked you, or at the SoHo forum, what model were you relying on? You say, I was relying on the Cato model that my co-authors and I developed, thinking this is the best way to measure it. And, given the model that we thought was best, these are the numbers that popped out. And that's why my statement was true. So clearly the National Academy of Sciences approach, you must find lacking. Like you think your model's better than theirs. Is this all correct what I'm saying so far?
Yes. And just to be clear, also the model that we did showed slightly worse for the National Academies update, showed slightly worse, just a little bit worse effects than what they actually found themselves when they did it.
Okay.
So because we made some changes that we thought would just make it more accurate. And the net effect for the model, when we took a look at this, we updated their old version, was slightly worse than what they did. So that's, there's a lot of junk in here. But generally the one that I was pointing to and would point to and mentioned was our update of the model, which did find more positive effects in all of the scenarios. And what's interesting in both the National Academy's model and in the model that we did is in at least every version of the Cato model, immigrants had a better fiscal impact than natives. And in most of them for the National Academies, it was the same way. So, it's sort of all over the place. And so if you see what I mean? Yeah, so it's like a relative effect.
Yeah, let me say that for the listeners. So you're saying they're actually, that I might be leading people to believe there's this huge divergence between the results of the 2 models, but actually for yours for sure, and then even in many of the specific head-to-head scenarios in even the National Academy of Science model, immigrants are burden the government less than native borns do with both models. It's just in yours, they're actually net contributors, whereas in the National Academy of Sciences, everybody is a net drain on the government. It's just the natives are worse than the immigrants are.
That's right.
Okay, here's something that occurred to me. People might be like, well, then who the heck? It's because the government is running a deficit? Is that how this can be possible? Like, how can it be that everybody's in net burden on the governments because the government's going deeper into debt every year? Is that the answer?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Catastrophically so.
All right. It's in other words, it's not like Martians are like, man, these Earthlings are just killing us, both native born and immigrants. Okay, so given all that, then you don't need to say regression 19 table 7, but just big picture for someone who's like, okay, so if you're up there on the SoHo debate stage telling everybody with confidence immigrants either are a net benefit or break even, basically, you must implicitly be saying that your model is better than the National Academy of the Sciences model, because otherwise it would be an open question, right? Or, in other words, why do you think yours is methodologically better? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of reasons for that. So one is that, going back to microeconomics, right? When there's more people who come in, a profit maximizing firm that employs individuals, they're also going to increase their investment in capital goods. So let's say you have like a work site, a construction site with 10 workers, they hire an 11th. They're also going to buy a hammer to give that guy a hammer. Otherwise, that person's not going to be very productive on the work site. So what we took account for is the extra amount of capital investment that occurs in the economy that would not have occurred if the immigrants weren't there, but that did because the immigrants are there. And then the tax slice of that is paid as a result of those extra immigrants, and then allocated that through like basically tax incidents to try to find out that that was like a result of the immigrants being here. So we did that. We also allocated all of the native-born Americans, so like the children of the immigrants, we put those in the second generation category because they're natives. And so that's the reason. And there's good reasons to do it either way. And we did it either way in the appendix to try to give it. So we did that. And then we did, the National Academies made this.
Wait, can I stop you? Because the National Academy of Sciences just kept them in the immigrant bucket the whole time? Am I understanding?
They did. They did. They kept them in. It was like until they were like 18, they kept them in. So as long as they were dependents, they kept them in that bucket, which leads to some like really weird results, I think, and are methodologically a little unsound results. So
forgive me, but I mean, since I'm asking you to explain it, I want to make sure I get it. So what you guys did though, so the National Academy of Sciences, immigrants come in, they have kids in the U.S. While the kids are minors, dependents, they still include them as immigrants, and so those kids' net burden on the government is counted against the immigrants, colloquially. Whereas you guys, the citizens, because they were born here, are in the native-born bucket, and they're not.
Yes.
That's not dinging the immigrants, because we're trying to explain why is it that you find immigrants are less burdensome than the NAS people do.
Yeah, so it also reallocates the taxes. So it's like, it's on net makes the second generation a little bit worse off fiscally, their fiscal impact than natives. And then the other thing, and this was one of the biggest impacts that we found, was that the national, like if somebody comes when they're like 16 to the US, the model has to then estimate what their final education is going to be. And you can understand why that's kind of weird and tricky. So what the National Academies of Science did was that they basically assumed that they are going to get their parents' education levels to the age that their parents were educated at the age of 25. And what we did was we took a look at people under the age of 25. We had a regression to predict where their education would be based on where people of the same ethnicity are, who are native-born Americans, like or immigrants are in the United States already. So we did sort of a different way of estimating that, and it did get, we thought, a little bit more accurate. And then we did some things where we allocated some federal scholarship benefits a little bit differently, basically to that actually made immigrants look worse off because we didn't think it was fair to allocate the way that they did. It was messed up. So a bunch of these like differences, but the big ones were the education differences and the capital market adjustment. And I could talk about something else in here if you're curious.
I am, but just let me the education one. Let me just follow up on that just to make sure I get what you're saying. To do this with the data you have available, or at least to do it so that you're not getting bogged down and getting all kinds of data, you need to make some estimates about how much education the kids are going to get, because that what like affects how much they pay in taxes or whatever. It makes a difference. The guy grows up to be an accountant versus, doing yard work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so for whatever, because of the particulars, the NAS model implicitly assumed that the kids wouldn't go on to get as much education as your model does. And that's why in yours, they end up being better for the IRS.
That's a little bit, that's one of the reasons why. And so they sort of attached it by looking at more at the, like the parents' education level and the parents being immigrants themselves. And then we looked more at what do people of the same ethnicity get, like in the United States via these regressions.
Okay.
So it's a little bit more like better. It seemed to work out a little bit better because of like the predictive features of the model. So like, that was the last thing I was going to ask you. Is that, because we're not just talking about hypothetically right now, all the immigrants coming in, what's going to happen over the next 50 years. Some of this is like, couldn't you just go look at the data? Like, don't we know? Isn't there a fact of the matter? And that's what we did.
But
yeah.
Okay.
And that's what we did just a slightly different way by looking at like a slightly different comparison group. Instead of just attaching it to their parents, we attached it to the group in general that they came from by broad ethnicity. We couldn't do it by country of origin, unfortunately, because the samples were too small, but we did it by broader ethnicity for like Hispanics or African immigrants and East Asian immigrants.
Okay. All right. I think I get what you're saying. Can you maybe this might help some people. They might be confused. Is it that, because it sounds like, somebody might ask, I don't get, why do you guys need to like make assumptions where like, isn't it just a matter of you just go look and just count up and say, here's all the immigrants and here's how much they paid in and here's how much they got. And like, I get, maybe you got to sample 1 out of 100 or something because there's too many, but what is this? Why do you need a model to predict what their kids do? Don't we just see?
Great question. No, it's a really good question. So backward facing, when we look at the past, we can just look at the data. And that's what, we do when we talk about the past. But when we're looking forward and trying to make a projection about what will happen, because that we think is more important, right? So like if an immigrant comes in today and the guy is 22 years old and he is a high school dropout and he starts working immediately, off the boat, he is going to be a net fiscal contributor because he doesn't have access to welfare and he's working right away and we didn't even have to pay for his public education, right? So it's like this fiscal windfall. But if that guy gets older and he retires in the United States and he has access to Social Security and Medicare, all of a sudden he could actually end up being a tremendous drain on welfare benefits. So we need to try to predict what that person would do based on what current people do who are like in similar situations, but they're older. You see what I mean? So that's why you have this model, because it's sort of what we were talking about earlier, where the welfare state and the American fiscal state is so temporal in both when it collects taxes from you and when it gives you benefits. And so it's really misleading to take like a slice in time and then to say, well, they're, net fiscal contributors or they're a fiscal drain when these people age and that all changes dramatically. So for instance, like I went to public school in California. If you were to stop counting me at the age of like 18, you'd say, well, that guy is a tremendous waste. And, maybe you think that anyway. But, that guy's a tremendous waste, a tremendous drain. But that wouldn't be like a fair accounting because I also will have, 40, 50 years of working and paying taxes. And we need to try to come up with a way of judging that to compare to see whether I would be a net fiscal drain on the state. A lot of assumptions.
No, I know. I'm trying to. I want to make sure I isolate though. So, for example, when you're saying from the SoHo platform, our study shows that immigrants we think are net contributors, or at the very least break even. Are you saying, like over the last 30 years, that was the case, or are you saying even that's a little bit? There's nuance there because over the last 30 years, if you're looking at some 19-year-old, yeah, he might have been a burden up till now, but the present discounted value of what he's going to do. And so really that guy, like, we're not being hypothetical. We're saying, no, it's a real guy that's in the data set that we're analyzing, but it'd be kind of wrong to call him a net burden because he's about to go work for 30 years. Are you saying that?
That's part, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So we're taking that into account.
Okay.
As much as we can with the data, and we're of course assuming that public policy and spending and taxes, aren't going to change, which is, probably the biggest crazy assumption we make. It's just that we can't predict.
Okay, let me ask you this then. Is it coherent then to say from 1950 to the year 2000, just looking at that period, yep, there's some weird stuff on the front end and on the back end in terms of, newborns and people who are just getting, but that'll all wash out over a 50-year stretch. Did immigrants contribute more or less to the Treasury's bottom line? Are you saying that technically is a distinct question from what the NAS and you did?
From that,
I mean, besides just the
elements of both,
points.
it's elements of both of that. So we do have a backward-facing portion, but on the forward-facing portion, yes, what you described is distinct, and the forward-facing portion is what's most important.
So I think
that makes sense.
When people are saying, hey, I think immigrants, they're more trouble than they're worth, and somebody says, no, actually, the data show. I think most people. I'm not saying it's a criticism. I'm just saying, I think most people assume that when people are arguing, what they mean is looking backwards, what has been the case up till now. And so is that, do you still think it is true that, over the last 50 years, looking backwards, not doing estimates of present discount, like right now, a 19-year-old has been a net burden, end of story. We don't know. He could get hit by a bus next week. That looking backwards, do you still think it's true that immigrants, if you do the capital, accounting and all the stuff you talked about and allocation of the scholarships and whatnot, that they contributed more to the total U.S. fiscal position?
Yes. So even with the national academies, that's true. We have a few tables and figures in here about that. So even for the national academies, that's true, because the year that we updated it for, which was 2018, that was one of the worst years, basically for fiscal effects for immigrants. So looking backwards from that point, it is a ratio above 1 in most of those years, where they did pay more than they consumed in taxes than they consumed in benefits. Now, the interesting difference here is that on the state and local level, it is usually worse. So immigrants usually consume more benefits than they pay in taxes on the state and local level in most of these models. But on the federal government, they usually pay more in taxes than they consume in benefits. So there's this distinction there, partly because of the types of taxes that are collected and the types of benefits that they consume. So they consume a lot of like state and local benefits in terms of education primarily.
Right. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Hey, everybody. Bob Murphy here with a quick tip for small business owners. If your business isn't showing up online, your competitors are getting the leads and you're missing out. Well, that's where Persist SEO comes in. For over 15 years, they've been helping local businesses grow through SEO, paid ads, and the latest in AI-powered search optimization, so you stay visible and competitive in the digital age. Whether you're in home services, legal, or healthcare, Persist SEO delivers real results without locking you into long-term contracts or overwhelming you with tech jargon. Visit ineedseo.help or call 770-580-3736 to schedule your free consultation. That's ineedseo.help. Easy to remember, powerful for your business. Now, a minute ago, you said there was something else in there you wanted to discuss.
That's what it was.
That was?
That's what it was. The federal versus state distinction.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Are you... I don't need to get bogged down with the institution stuff unless you want to say something about it. About the... actually, why don't we talk about it? Because I know I saw Ben present on this, and I actually was surprised. The paper that I found from you was not saying what I thought Ben had talked about. So anyway, can you just explain to people the claim about... or the concern is, well, they're coming from these countries where they're authoritarian or they got big welfare states and whatever. And so at the very least, yeah, maybe they're hardworking people and they're business owners and, God bless them, but they're going to come over here and eventually they're just going to vote for bigger government. So at the very least, that's why we got to stop this.
Yeah, I think it's the best argument against immigration. And if I were convinced that immigration or free immigration even would basically produce socialism in the United States or like radically worsen our economic situation by worsening laws, then I would oppose it because I think that's too costly. It's, economic growth is rare and we need to preserve the things that cause it. So, Ben Powell and I wrote a book about this, Wretched Refuse, and the paper that you referenced, we sort of made this assumption. We took a look at economic freedom scores on the state level in the United States. And then we assumed in this model, which is a model that is used to take a look at the spread of disease. So we assume that opinions supportive of socialism are basically like a disease that can spread, which I think is fair. Socialism is pretty damaging to our health and welfare. So trying to say like, okay, immigrants come from these countries like Mexico. They have a worse economic freedom score in the past. We're going to assume that somehow this score is like innate to them. It's like a virus that they carry. They carry it into these American states. And then what happens to the state economic freedom score as a result? And what we found over time is that immigrants just really don't affect it. So it's kind of like a boring result, right? Like it's one of these things where, man, I wish it was sexy. But no, it really doesn't affect it. And what's interesting is the economic freedom score improved in a lot of these countries where immigrants came from in the last several decades, quite a bit. And so what's interesting is when you compare that to a lot of American states, the net effect should have been to slightly improve, actually, the institutions of some American states. But that didn't happen either. So it's like a big nothing burger where I'm not that afraid. As a result, we don't see immigrants worsening the institutions of American states, but we also don't see them making them better when they come from places that have, relatively improved a good amount compared to American states. Does that make sense?
I understand the words coming out of your mouth, but I still want to make sure I understand the argument. So first of all, are you saying that there's no, like, using that? It was the kind of thing, like, once I started worrying that I couldn't pronounce the word, then I just couldn't do it. Epidemiological. That's the word right there.
The biggie.
Yes. If I just said it and didn't, preface it by saying I had trouble pronouncing it, so it was the kind of thing you just, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But anyway, that using that model, you're saying, no, it just doesn't look like, there's no spread at all, or there's no statistically significant results, or however you want to couch it. But is it that because they're not voting, or just because the way they vote is indistinguishable from the states where they end up? I mean, that seems odd.
We don't know about the mechanism specifically that happened. Now, I could speculate based on wider literature in political science and others that took a look at this. So one factor is that their public opinion on public policy issues is not that different from native-born Americans. Okay. Secondly, it becomes more like native-born Americans the longer they're here. So they assimilate a bit on these opinions. So once they naturalize and can vote. And then the other thing is that native-born Americans in places with more immigrants, like up to a point, generally start to vote a little bit more conservative. So there seems to be this also like partial native-born reaction that pushes a lot of native-born voters a little bit more in the conservative direction. And then the other factor is, and this might be a little bit politically incorrect, but we don't care about that, is that when there's more ethnic and racial diversity in a place, there is generally a little bit slower growth in a lot of these types of benefits. It doesn't mean that like the state shrinks, because that very rarely happens. But we do see a general result, and there's exceptions to this, right? So, and we can all think of some exceptions where it doesn't grow as fast. And so we see that sort of happen over time. And actually one interesting example of this is that Texas had more state level affirmative action until recently than California has had when it comes to like education in the state, because California has had a higher immigrant percentage for a while, and they've just voted like consistently against affirmative action in higher education. And part of the argument there is that when you have a more ethnically diverse area, all of a sudden the winners get diluted from affirmative action. The winners get diluted. Right. They're fighting amongst each other. And then actually the groups of people who would lose are actually grow. So one of the things you saw in California is the group of people who lose the most was actually Asian Americans. White Americans, the estimates, there was actually like within the margin of error how they would do. In earlier years, they would have fared worse on net negative. And then Hispanics would gain a bit, and then blacks would gain the most. And so once you have that sort of thing, it's like, okay, all of a sudden you got a lot of Hispanics in the state. They don't gain that much, so they're not too enthusiastic about it. You've got Asians who are very active politically in the state, and they lose a ton, and they hate it. And then whites don't like it. So you've got this sort of weird thing going on where all of a sudden, if the place were like just black and white, there'd be more likelihood of it sort of going through, because it's sort of something that people do for a small minority type, welfare handout thing.
Right. Okay. I could keep going on this, but I'm just looking at the clock here, and we've already, I think, burned too much time on this because there's other things I want to get to. So let's jump right to the heart of it. Let me very quickly summarize what Dave's position is. And actually, let me say as a preface, because Jacob Hornberger and Richard Ebeling challenged Dave and me to a debate on immigration, and I had to clarify to them, I don't agree with Dave on this stuff. It's like, and so I understand in retrospect what happened is that, Dave's been saying this stuff for 2 years. People are like, oh, you just hate brown people, and don't you know libertarianism is based on non-aggression principle, idiot. And, why don't you go work on your stand-up material? And so I was kind of saying, wait, whoa, and instead of clarifying, no, what he's saying is And then after a while of me doing that, it came off as if I were fully, endorsing his view. So with those disclaimers, though, folks, so here, let me just say quickly, Dave's point, or one of his points, is to say what he's challenging is this notion that the libertarian default position should just be open borders, because who the heck are a bunch of politicians to interfere with some guy crossing some line on a map and then some guy hiring him? That's a voluntary trade. How can any libertarian, that's like, just like goods can come in, you don't like tariffs. Why would you like immigration restrictions? And then he goes into various analogies about if there's public property, even though we don't like it, given that it exists, at that point, it's not obvious that the libertarian position is, hey, a 50-year-old heroin addict could just camp out in the girls' bathroom in a public school, that most people would say, I don't think that's necessarily the libertarian outcome. And once you open that door, it's not obvious anymore what the libertarian position should be regarding public property. And so if 95% of Americans would not want 1 billion people immigrating here over the next 10 years, why is that crazy to say that, the government shouldn't let that happen?
So I think that when talking about this public property criticism of free immigration, I think there's like a different starting point that a lot of us come from, which is sort of the presumption of liberty. So the idea that we should have, if we have to have a state, that state should be as minimally interfering in our lives as possible. And so when we have public property that's owned by the government, I think that public property criticism, that sort of Hans Hermann Hoppe or Dave Smith point, results in a state vastly more powerful and intrusive into our lives than it is under the current arrangement where, some private property is funded or some public property is funded by tax revenue. And we allow people to traverse that and engage in mutually beneficial voluntary exchanges. But that if we were to allow the state to regulate that property to the extent a private property owner would be allowed to, it would result in, one, I don't know how you could do it. I think you run into economic calculation problems that are pretty difficult. Impossible to overcome, right? So that was part of the debate. We talked about like, well, how do you measure that? Like the median voter through like a democratic system? Like how do you channel this type of thing? But secondly, that it would result in a degree of control that would be, I think, intolerable and nearly tyrannical. So for instance, there are times in American history where there was a, gross, and I'm picking on this for historical reasons, but like a gross amount of like anti-Catholicism in the United States in the past. I mean, you read the things that people used to write in the 19th century and just, in my opinion, like really vile, bigoted opinions against Catholics. And so I think you can imagine a period of time where, the highways were owned by the majority, by the U.S. government, and people have been like, we don't want these Catholics. And so in order to use I wouldn't let a Catholic into my house. So I don't want them on my private property. None are allowed. Therefore, we don't let them on the roads. And I think that is a degree of government control over people's lives that would lead to actually much less libertarian outcomes and lead to much more statist control over the economy, reductions in freedom of association, et cetera. And I think there's a good middle ground on here where, we had free immigration in the 19th century. Catholics could use the roads, but people weren't allowed to pitch tents in the middle of them. And so I'm just think like there's not a good amount of like marginal thinking here in state management of public property that you and I would like to see privatized. But there's like, marginal differences in how the state manages things. And I don't think we need to go like whole hog and say, no, they should be able to manage it like the most, I don't want to say tyrannical, but the most like bigoted private property owner would say, right? Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying.
You understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
Let me push back.
Yes.
Okay, so the government schools, there's an 8th grader. He's in the bathroom. He texts his drug dealer buddy and he say, "Hey, I need a bag of weed or something." And the guy comes in and he wants to come in and sell the kid the drugs in the bathroom. And then some people, even some calling themselves libertarian, think that no, the government is authorized to prevent that from happening, even though it's a guy crossing a border. Should be a presumption of liberty. It's a voluntary transaction that's about to go down. And actually, historically, there has been a lot of segregation and just outright racism when it comes to government administration of schools. So clearly, to avoid tyranny, if some kid texts his drug dealer in the bathroom at school, some 8th grader, he should, who the heck, what kind of a libertarian would allow that to happen?
Yeah, so this is something where I agree, I think, with Dave on this, that the management of public property allows the state to do a few things that a private property owner would do, but not all the things that a private property owner can do, right? So I don't think I think a school to say, yeah, you can't sell drugs in the bathroom, and if you find you, we're gonna kick you out. But I don't think a school can be like, well, you're praying the rosary in the bathroom. We're going to kick you out. So there's like a difference here in this, right? Whereas if it were your school, right, or my school, you could be like, in libertarian land, like, I don't want people of a certain religion or engage in certain speech, and that's fine in libertarian land. But I don't think that we can give the state the same amount of power over the property that it owns as we should give like private property owners to do. And I don't think that the way of like channeling this median voter is a good way to do it. What I think is a way to do it is like what worsens or makes the product that they are selling or forcing us to buy worse. I think that's the measure of what really matters here.
Okay, so I'm just going to say this. I don't want to get bogged down just because I think some people might be flipping out in that. Yeah, if you go into the bathroom and in the stall pray the rosary, they're not going to know and kick you out. But I think in many public schools you couldn't openly pray, or they might tell you to stop.
Well, I mean, I had a Christian club in my high school, in public school. I don't know what those rules are currently.
Okay. I don't know. There could be lawsuits. I don't know. I'm just saying. I want to just raise it. I don't know if how accurate that is in some people. It probably varies jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
There's probably some variance. I know you can't have like official school time that is specifically set aside for something like that. But I know that there are Christian clubs on campuses and you can do that. And I don't think there's any rule that prevents you from, like, say, for instance, praying during lunch hour or something, like on your own time. But like if you get up in the middle of class and disrupt class, right, and start loudly praying or using your free speech rights, then I think it's fair for them to be like, get the hell out. But it's not because of what you're saying, but it's just because you're worsening the service that they're trying to provide. So I think that's the standard. Like, are they worsening the service that they're trying to provide?
Okay. And again, with this stuff, and I would have explained this already, Alex, in the pre-recorded introduction that I'm going to do in the future, but from their perspective, they already heard it's kind of weird. That I'm not here to debate you. I just want to like make sure we cover things, and I just want to get your perspective on something. So are you assuming, it seems to me that there's an implicit assumption here that, well, yeah, any reasonable person can say the government, as running, everyone agrees the government shouldn't own the highways, but given that they do, they got to set rules. Yeah, they can have speed limits, they can have traffic lights, they can have stop signs. They can't say Muslims aren't allowed to drive. Like you can't do that. And that would be, tyrannical to do so. And one way we could see that is we can kind of predict that in a market economy, some big corporate owner of a road as big as an interstate, why would they do that? They wouldn't just exclude, even though they in principle would have the legal ability to do that. Why would they do that? That'd be stupid to say Muslims can't drive on our road. And so I'm wondering though, do you think if everything were privatized next Thursday, like that all the international airports, that they would just let, in theory, a billion people just come through and there would be no system in place to kind of vet people or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm not saying that as a reductive absurd. I'm asking.
No, I think they would charge prices, right? I mean, prices would regulate this. I mean, if the demand for airlines, for trips to the U.S. would increase a lot, and we could assume the prices for that would increase a lot. The way that privatized airports works around the world, right, is they auction off like slots for planes to land. Those prices would go up. Those prices would be passed on to the customers. The immigrants would come in. They'd pay their tickets like their normal tickets. That money would be passed on to the slots. The immigrants would come in. They'd take an Uber to their destination and pay just like, you and I do when we go someplace else and grab an Uber. And then the Ubers pay the tolls on the roads in the same way that you and I right now pay like this gas tax. Which funds the highways and stuff like that.
I know what I want to ask you now. I'm getting excited. All right.
Okay, cool.
I wasn't even going to go down this path, but I realized that it's tricky because we're like debating minarchy and it doesn't work. It's like, again, I had the Soviet Union asking me how many grocery stores should we have. Okay. So I don't know what your own view. So I am an anarcho-capitalist in the Rothbardian tradition. In grad school, I wrote a novel, and in that it involved this, island in the Pacific that went total ANCAP. And what I pictured at the time is how it would work is like the legal system and so forth, that in general, a lot of property owners, like certainly to work at a major, like a law firm or something, like to have a 9 to 5 job or something, you would need some kind of external entity pledging to indemnify people if you hurt them. So it could either be like a fraternal organization or it could just be an outright insurance company. Just like doctors right now have to have malpractice insurance in order to do surgery, or you need to have liability coverage to drive on the road. And so likewise, I thought all the major real estate owners would have these clauses that to come onto my property, you need to show that you have coverage from some entity. Otherwise, I don't want you mixing it because, you could go shoot somebody and run away, and then, we have no way of catching you or getting compensated. All right. So that was kind of the framework. And so then I thought in this novel that, the governments around the world, when they had like serial killer, like undesirables, they would just go dump them on this anarchist island in the Pacific and get rid of them. And the island would accept them, but only because Like there were companies, at the docks that would take them in, and then they would interview them, have psychologists, and they would have like gradual work programs. They'd put them in secure work sites where they couldn't just, go around with a machete and kill people. And then over time, as they exhibited things, they would get more and more like let into broader areas until they were finally just like, interchangeable with other members of the community. And that was kind of how I envisioned it. And I get like going from that to the United States right now. It's not obvious. What does that look like? But anyway, I'm done there. Do you want to respond to that?
I want to read your novel. First off,
okay.
What's the name of it? Did you publish
Minerva.
it? Minerva.
Yeah. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please do. I want to read that.
Okay.
Secondly, if that were the type of situation, that sounds pretty good. I have, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist. Okay. I come from, I think, some of the David Friedman concerns about some of the provision of some public goods. I am not convinced that the anarcho-capitalist answers are sufficient for that. Now, I could be, but that's purely like a consequentialist concern that I have with that. Right. But if what you describe works pretty, like there's no defectors, I assume there's no defectors who are sort of residents of this island.
What do you mean defectors?
Person who is there, who owns some property maybe, and they're not abiding by these general rules about, indemnification and letting people on. They just let people on.
I mean, they could. It's just they would have to stay on their own land. That's the idea. Like, so it's not that like there's, you need to have X, Y, and Z in order, or else armed agents come and grab you and throw you in a cage. It's that everybody can say, if you don't abide by X, Y, and Z, get off my land. And then if most of the people in the society do that, then that's de facto. This is like the rule of law.
Yeah. I could imagine situations with some externalities that would be difficult to resolve. But I look forward to reading the book. Sorry, I don't want to go off into talking about anarcho-capitalist or libertopia. But I mean, that doesn't sound like a bad, system to me. And so I think that would work okay. And the rules that I support for the U.S. government having to restrict immigration against people who are, violent property criminals, sick people, national security threats. It sounds like the rules that your society has would be closely correlated with the types of rules that I would like the government to have in the United States, and that they did have for a period of time in the 19th century.
Okay, so I mean,
the thing is, like, we're trying to figure out what the state would do in a situation where the state has been involved, where private answers would be in a scenario or in a sector where the state has been dominant for a very long time.
Okay, so I guess, because earlier I thought what you were saying is, no, if somebody in, Egypt wants to buy a flight to LaGuardia, and once it gets all privatized, it would just be, did their credit card work? And, if the guy shows up in Egypt trying to get on the plane and he's got, a sawed-off shotgun, they're not going to let him get on the plane. But in general, they're not going to do background checks and see what kind of person is it. Yeah, does his credit card work? Yeah, he can fly. That's what I thought you were saying. But now it sounds like, no, there is some kind of procedure you want in place to make sure somebody with tuberculosis or who's a serial killer who's wanted in 8 countries fleeing justice, that they're not getting in. So I'm just saying, again, I'm not trying to, I understand why you're saying that's analogous to you can't camp out on the highway, but we also can't ban Muslims from driving, that you think that yours is the common sense approach. There's a presumption of liberty. I get all that. I'm not playing dumb with you, but on the other hand, it isn't just an obvious, like, oh yeah, you can't ban heroin, if you're a libertarian. Like here, it does sound like you have plenty of limitations on people's freedom of movement in mind. It's just you think yours are objective.
Well, I think that the limitations, I don't know if they're objective, right? I mean, there are certain goals that I want, so thinking about it in terms of consequentialism. So I'm open to deleting some of these from the list if the evidence shows that they should be, or adding others if there's like another externality I haven't considered. But I generally think that immigrants who either have harmed the life, liberty, and property of other people, through coercion or through very damaging negative externalities like drug-resistant tuberculosis or something, or like we are, very confident there's a high probability that they were to do so, then I'm fine with excluding some of those people and using the power of the government to stop some of those people from coming. So that's like the framework that I have. It's like a very 19th century classical liberal framework for taking a look at this, rather than a sort of, it's not so much like a Murray Rothbard influenced way of viewing it, if that makes sense.
Right. Yep. Okay. Is there any other substantive point, like on the public property question issue you wanted to make?
Let's see. I think we covered it pretty well.
Okay.
And
that's
described it well
fine
for people. Yeah, I thought
Okay,
we did a good job of breaking down some of the issues in there.
Okay, great. Because I wanted to move on, but I didn't want to, in case there was something you wanted to get out, I want to give you a chance. Okay, so my next question is, and I tried to find this beforehand, and I couldn't. I saw an example where you were like sitting with Brian Kaplan and someone was interviewing, and I think Brian said some stuff. But my question just is, if we did have your system in place, if you had to guess over the next 10 years, how many immigrants do you think would come to the U.S.? Just so people have a notion of what do you mean when you're like, no, this is what I favor. Like, because I'm wondering if part of this is the people who think, quote, open borders is suicide. I'm wondering, are they imagining something that you think, no, that many people aren't going to come here?
In 10 years, probably like 50 to 100 million above who would come normally.
And what's the normal, like, so what's the absolute number, not just relative?
So it would be like 60 to 110 million.
So you think it would not even double? Am I understanding what your claim is?
So not even double the U.S. population?
No. What would the flow be? Status quo over the next 10 years, what's the influx? And then with your system, what's the influx?
So the status quo is about 1 million a year.
Okay.
Right now, legally.
Okay.
And then I think that there would be 50 to 100 million on top of that.
Okay. All right. So like 5 to 10x?
Yeah.
Okay. The flow. Okay. And then, all right.
And that's the gross flow, by the way. That's the gross, not the net. Because some people will leave after coming in, etc. So that's just a gross flow, but yeah.
Okay. So is this true that if we had your system 10 years from now, is it possible, like a third of the total U.S. population at that point would have immigrated within the last decade? Is that a true statement?
Yeah, it would be about a quarter to a third. Yeah, somewhere in there.
Okay. So, and I guess if someone had to say, why would I want that world rather than the status quo, among other things, you'd say, for one thing, let's not forget the benefits to the immigrants and the people they love, like their productivity is going to be so much higher and, global GDP, blah, 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 all the remittances they can send back. That might not be your primary concern, Mr. Viewer, but let's not leave that aside. That's a huge improvement for humanity. But then also, boosting real wages for most of the people that would have been here either way under either scenario?
Yeah. So there's more productivity in the U.S., including for native-born Americans, higher wages, an enormous number of new firms that could start to service these people, a large amount of jobs that are available, very highly growing economy, a lot of science. I think there'd be more scientific, discoveries, etc. So like all the good things that come from a very highly expanding economy. Basically, the big benefits of like a big rise in the birth rate, but really shortened to a much shorter period of time.
Yep. Oh, I'm glad you said that, because that, for me, when I was younger, just thinking about the economics of immigration, I did realize that I had to always cross-check my intuitions with birth, the next generation, and that, it's not like, oh my gosh, we can't keep having so many kids because otherwise the jobs will all run out of jobs or something, or the younger people will take all our jobs. Like, no one talks like, well, some people do maybe, but we realize that's not a particular concern.
Not us. Not us. Right. We're not talking like that. We're not a bunch of these Malthusian nut jobs.
And so when you, just out of curiosity, when you say like more scientific discoveries, you mean because some budding science, some Albert Einstein, if he's over in whatever, Bangladesh or something, he might not get the opportunity. Whereas if he comes over here, then he will. In other words, they're not coming from Mars. They're coming from somewhere else. Like, why wouldn't they have made the discovery wherever they were?
Yeah, and that's because the U.S. has better economic institutions. So there's a reason why firms invest more in the United States to do scientific, just to build normal factories and everything else, but also just to do more scientific investigation here. Property rights are more, all the reasons we know. Property rights are more secure. Contract rights are better. When the government steals from you, you usually know how it's going to happen in advance. And that is all a big improvement over India, for instance. And we see this in the U.S. where Indian Americans are, extraordinarily successful. And, part of that is because we've skimmed off the best of the best with our immigration system. But there are a large number of people over there who could do extremely well, and they would bring a lot of these talents over here and make a better investment in a more free market economy where they'd be able to discover more.
Okay, great. So last topic now. Are you good if we go like another 10 minutes or so?
Yes.
Okay, great. Is, again, let me be the MAGA listener hearing this, and he just can't believe this gobbledygook coming from this guy from Cato, whatever that is. And he says, as you guys are recording this, there is an armed insurrection going on. People that they love their country and they're flying the flag, but yet they want to stay here. Well, that doesn't make any sense. They're attacking federal agents. They're lighting cars on fire, even unmanned cars who aren't hurting anybody. Just they're coming to bring people to their destination, and they're getting attacked. These poor innocent cars. And so, what are you talking about? And also, this isn't just some accident. The Biden administration, so this person would say, allege, deliberately let these people in as part of their agenda, to whether it's to influence future voting or just to cause unrest or whatever, to discredit Trump, who knows what. But this is clearly a deliberate long-term campaign that was put in motion. And maybe you honestly believe what you're saying, Mr. Economist guy, but if we had anything close to what you're talking about, this country would just be, there'd be no way we could turn this ship around.
So, well, thank you, anonymous MAGA listener. No, but my
name is Carl, by the way.
Carl, I appreciate it. The thing I would say, Carl, is the chaos that we're seeing in Los Angeles. And I want to just preface this by saying rioting is never justified. I don't think there's a time when I can think of rioting being justified, and destruction of private property of random people in protest or as just criminal engagement, which is what almost all rioting is. It's just criminals taking advantage of a situation, right? So that's never justified. And those people should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. And if any of them are illegal immigrants, they should be deported if they are apprehended for rioting like that. So I agree with you that is horrible. But secondly, I would say this chaos is happening in the midst of an immigration enforcement regime run by the federal government, where ICE agents are going to private businesses. They are doing workplace raids. They are getting warrants. Sometimes they're not getting warrants and making them up after the fact unlawfully. And they are interrupting the private market arrangements between willing workers and willing buyers. And I think although rioting is inexcusable, I don't think it's entirely crazy to predict that eventually something like this would happen when you have a warehouse of people who are apprehended and feelings get too, out of whack, and people don't want to be separated from their jobs and their families, and they react violently and inappropriately in my regard, but that this is sort of a reasonably foreseeable thing. And so I think if we're in the interest of social cohesion and the interest of preventing a lot of this, I think the federal government should pull back a little bit. But the state and local governments and the feds to some extent should harshly punish rioters and people who are actually engaging in violent action. But they should pull back from immigration enforcement actions that seek to separate otherwise peaceful workers from their employers who just want to, employ them in a mutually beneficial voluntary exchange.
Okay. Is it fair to, again, make an analogy like with the drug war and say, look, many libertarians, wherever they stand on the immigration question, can at least understand if there was some example in the news of like a bunch of drug dealers, like, getting in a shootout with the DEA or something, and some agents get killed, and all the, Trump supporters are freaking out about, we needed to go to war with the cartels, and a standard libertarian response would be, yeah, they shouldn't have done that. It's a tragedy that, they used violence against these DEA, but, big picture, this kind of stuff is inevitable when you're trying to interfere with voluntary commerce among consenting adults. We should end the drug war, and you won't see this kind of stuff anymore. Is that analogous to what you're saying here?
That is analogous to what I'm saying. And it's the same thing with like prohibition. We had a big surge in crime when alcohol was illegal. And we resolved that issue by legalizing alcohol. It wasn't as deregulated as I wanted to be, but still an improvement of legalization. And as a result, the black market shrank, and a lot of these negative pernicious effects shrank. And I think that is what would happen if we legalized a lot of immigration, is we get less of this black market violence, less of this activity. And, as I said earlier, I'm not an anarchist. So I do think there's a role for law enforcement to go after the people, whether they're immigrants or native-born Americans, who are violating other people's rights, and to focus on using the force of the law on them and not on people who are just working.
Okay. I guess the last question I have is, I saw on Twitter, people were fighting with Dave a bit, and then somebody, well, it was in response to, Hornberger and Ebling challenging us to it, and he was saying, no, I debated the best guy I could find on this issue, and I'm going to move on and focus on other things. And then someone in the, referring to you, of course, and then someone in the comments said the best guy you could find, and had a clown emoji. And so I just wonder, how did that make you feel?
I didn't see that one.
Okay.
But
how does it make you feel now that I've told you?
I guess it, of all the comments that people give me online, that one's pretty good. So I think that's actually on the nice, if I was like that, that's on the nice side of the comments that I get. So fair enough.
Let me say while I have you here that I, of course, I relished the debate and looking for it. I was pleasantly surprised. You were funnier than I thought you were going to be. So I'm not. That's supposed to be a compliment. I don't know if that came off as a backhanded compliment, but that's.
It did, but it was funny, so it's okay.
It was good TV. All right.
No, it was a lot of fun debating with Dave. We got along really well. He and I have had some disagreements on the internet, and so he was a great guy in person. I don't think he and I are going to have any more of those types of disagreements online, even though we, have sparred in the past. And it's a lot easier to do that when you go face to face with somebody and talk with them. And I know,
right.
You and I have had some disagreements online. I know we didn't want to talk about it, but I think those, to the extent that those are my fault, I apologize for that. I think they're unwarranted looking back. And I think going forward, I'm not going to at least have any more of those, because I actually like you and think you're a pretty funny guy.
I promise folks watching this at home that we did not plan this. This is all spontaneous kumbaya here at the end.
Spontaneous bromance.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, that's a good spot to wrap up. My guest has been Alex Nowrasteh, Cato's lead immigration guy, but perhaps not the best guy Dave could have found, according to some Twitter commentators. So, Alex, joking aside, thanks for your time and clarifying, and I think this will certainly help people to make a more informed decision about how should libertarians feel about the immigration question.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I really enjoyed this. This was a ton of fun, and I hope someday we can do it again.
Me too. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.